Maggie once believed in fairy tales. She believed love could conquer all, that her marriage to Thomas, the man she loved with every fiber of her being, was the beginning of a life full of laughter, dreams, and companionship. Their wedding had been simple but heartfelt. She remembered standing in that small chapel, clutching a bouquet of white daisies, her heart pounding with both excitement and fear. Thomas had smiled at her that day, promising to love and protect her, promises that felt as fragile as glass now. But fairy tales lie. It wasn't long after Maggie moved into Thomas's family home that the cracks began to show. The house itself was grand, with marble floors that glistened under the light, tall curtains that swept like waterfalls from the ceilings, and hallways that felt like they led to nowhere. But behind the walls lay an undercurrent of hostility. And at the center of it all was Thomas's mother. From the first day, her eyes had judged Maggie, scanning her like an inferior product. "This is the girl you married?" she had scoffed, standing in the hallway while Maggie carried her bags inside. "A daughter of a carpenter? Thomas, is this how low our family has fallen?" Maggie had smiled politely, biting back tears, hoping to win her over with time. She cleaned the house meticulously, cooked Thomas's favorite meals, and tried to be the wife she believed a good woman should be. But it was never enough. "Is this what you call cooking?" his mother sneered one evening, looking at the steaming stew Maggie had placed on the table. "My son deserves better." Thomas sat silently, his eyes cast downward, chewing his food without a word. It was a small silence, but it thundered in Maggie's chest like an earthquake. Why didn't he defend her? Why didn't he stop his mother from tearing her down bit by bit? It wasn't just the words. It was the small cruelties that began to pile up, like bricks building a wall between them. The way Thomas's mother would rearrange Maggie's decorations as if her choices were tasteless. The way she criticized her clothes, her voice, the way she sat at the dining table. Maggie felt like an outsider in her own home. And Thomas? He had changed. Once, he had been her rock. A man who held her hand and whispered, "Don't worry, Maggie, I'll always be here." But now, Thomas was cold, distant, as though his love had evaporated with the rain that constantly beat against their windows. He barely spoke to her, barely looked at her, and when he did, it was with a look that made Maggie feel small, like a shadow. One night, Maggie found herself alone in their bedroom, clutching a photo from their wedding day. The smile on her face in the photo mocked her. She had been so full of hope then. Her tears fell onto the picture as she whispered to herself, "Where did I go wrong? Why does he let her treat me this way?" But no one answered. The house was silent, except for the ticking clock that seemed to count down to something inevitable. The night it all fell apart, the air in the house felt heavy, like a storm was brewing. Maggie had just finished clearing the dishes when Thomas's mother walked into the kitchen, her voice sharp like a knife. "Do you call this clean?" she hissed, pointing at the spotless counter. "You can't even manage a simple house, yet you think you're fit to be my son's wife? A girl with no pedigree, no refinement, just the daughter of a carpenter." Maggie froze, her hands trembling over the sink. She had heard these insults before, but tonight, something in the woman's tone was different, harsher, final. Maggie turned to defend herself, her voice small but steady. "I've done everything you've asked. Why do you hate me so much?" "You dare talk back to me?" The older woman's voice rose like a siren. "Ungrateful, useless girl. I knew you would ruin my son's life. Thomas!" The sound of his name echoed through the halls, and soon Thomas appeared at the doorway. Maggie turned to him, her eyes pleading. "Thomas, please." "What is it now, Mother?" His voice was tired, almost bored, as though the life had been drained from him. "She disrespected me," his mother spat, her fingers shaking as she pointed at Maggie. "She's poisoning this house with her presence. I've had enough, Thomas. Either she leaves or I do." Maggie's heart stopped. She looked at Thomas, desperate for him to say something, anything. To choose her. To defend her. But Thomas's face hardened, his eyes cold and unrecognizable. "Maybe she's right." "Thomas," Maggie whispered, her voice cracking like thin glass. "I said maybe she's right," he roared, his voice filling the room. "I can't keep living like this. You've brought nothing but trouble into my life, Maggie. Just get out." It felt like the world tilted off its axis. The words hit Maggie like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. "Thomas, you don't mean that." "I said get out," he bellowed, his voice like thunder. Before she knew it, Maggie found herself outside, the front door slamming behind her with a finality that echoed through the night. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking her hair and clothes, turning the dirt beneath her feet into mud. She stood there, frozen, her suitcase clutched tightly in one hand. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the cold seeped into her bones. The house loomed behind her, warm, glowing from the inside, but she no longer belonged there. It was no longer her home. She looked up at the sky, rain mixing with the tears streaming down her face. The sting of betrayal burned in her chest. They threw me out like I was nothing. The words played over and over in her mind as she took her first steps into the dark, her suitcase dragging behind her, the wheels leaving uneven tracks in the mud. Maggie had lost everything. Her home, her husband, her dignity. And as the rain fell harder, it washed away the last remnants of the life she thought she had. The rain had finally stopped when Maggie found herself standing on the threshold of a small apartment, Lucy's apartment. Lucy was her best friend, someone who had always been a constant in her life, a thread of kindness in a tapestry of chaos. Lucy opened the door, her face softening the moment she saw Maggie, soaked, shivering, clutching a battered suitcase as though it held the last of her dignity. Without a word, Lucy pulled her inside and wrapped her in a warm blanket. "What happened?" Lucy whispered, her voice a mix of concern and fury. Maggie didn't respond immediately. Her lips trembled as she tried to find the words to explain what couldn't be explained. "They threw me out," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucy's eyes flared with anger, but she swallowed it. "Stay here as long as you need, okay? You're not alone, Maggie." That night, Maggie curled up on Lucy's worn-out sofa, staring at the ceiling. The shadows danced on the walls as the room hummed with silence. She could hear Lucy in the kitchen, humming a tune, trying to distract herself. Maggie clutched the blanket tighter, feeling like a burden, like dead weight pulling Lucy down. The days that followed were relentless. Maggie woke up each morning to the harsh reality that her life had changed overnight. She needed to contribute, to pull herself out of the hole she had fallen into. But the only work she could find was the kind that left her hands calloused and her back aching. She took small jobs, scrubbing floors at local diners, washing dishes in steaming kitchens, folding laundry for strangers who didn't look her in the eye. Each task paid pennies, but Maggie didn't complain. She worked from morning till night, her body moving on autopilot while her mind replayed the events that had brought her here. In the solitude of her thoughts, Maggie wrestled with shame. She thought of Thomas, of the look on his face when he told her to leave. The man she once loved now haunted her like a ghost. How did I end up here? She wondered as she scrubbed stubborn stains from a kitchen floor, the smell of bleach stinging her nose. Her knees ached, her palms were raw, but none of it compared to the weight in her chest. At night, when the world was quiet, Maggie let the tears come. She would sit by the small window in Lucy's living room, looking out at the city lights, wondering where she belonged. The ache was constant, but so was the faint whisper of hope deep within her. "I'm more than this," she murmured to herself one night, her voice barely audible. Maggie refused to let her spirit be crushed, no matter how much life tried to weigh her down. Somewhere in the depths of her despair, she found a flicker of resolve. She didn't know how, but she knew she would rise again. She had to. "I don't know how to be anyone else," she said to Lucy one morning, her voice hollow as she folded laundry. "But I'll find a way. I'll find myself again." Lucy placed a hand on her shoulder, her eyes brimming with pride. "And when you do, Maggie, the world won't know what hit it." Those words stayed with Maggie. They lit a small fire in her heart, just enough to keep her moving forward, one step, one day at a time. She didn't need anyone's approval. Not anymore. She would rebuild herself, even if it took every ounce of strength she had left. It was a gray afternoon when Maggie stumbled into the small, unassuming cafe on the corner of the bustling street. Her legs ached from another long day of work, her shoes soaked from the puddles she'd stepped through, and her spirit felt as worn as the clothes she wore. The cafe was warm, a refuge from the cold drizzle outside. Its quiet hum of conversation, a stark contrast to the chaos of the city beyond its windows. She dropped into a chair by the far corner, hidden from view, and ordered the cheapest tea on the menu. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the chipped ceramic cup as steam rose to meet her face, warming her chilled skin. Maggie stared blankly out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. She didn't notice when a man entered the cafe, dressed in a tailored navy suit and carrying an air of calm authority that turned a few heads. Daniel Kingston spotted her almost immediately. He wasn't sure what drew his attention to the woman hunched in the corner, a quiet presence in a room full of noise, but something about her caught his eye. She looked lost, like a painting left unfinished. As he waited in line for his coffee, he kept glancing her way. When he finally received his order, Daniel found himself walking toward her. "Excuse me," he said gently, his voice deep but kind. Maggie blinked and looked up, startled. Her first instinct was to shrink into herself. "Sorry, do you need the table? I can leave." "No, please don't." Daniel pulled out the chair across from her, his tone leaving no room for rejection. "May I sit?" Maggie hesitated. Everything about this man screamed that he didn't belong in her world. The tailored suit, the pristine watch on his wrist, the confident way he carried himself. She gave a small, reluctant nod. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel studied her quietly, his gaze sharp yet compassionate. "Rough day?" he finally asked. Maggie let out a humorless laugh. "Rough life." Daniel smiled faintly as though he understood more than he let on. "You look like you could use a friend, or at least someone to listen." Maggie's brow furrowed. "Do I know you?" "No," he said simply, sipping his coffee, "but that doesn't mean I can't care." She stared at him, disbelief written all over her face. "Why would a man like you care about someone like me?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated herself for how small it sounded. Daniel set his cup down and leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but steady. "Because I've seen that look before. The look of someone who's been knocked down but isn't out yet." Maggie looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. "You don't know me," she whispered. "No," Daniel agreed, "but I'd like to." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her. For the first time in months, someone was looking at her, not through her, not with pity, but at her, like she mattered. Maggie didn't know who this stranger was or why he seemed to care, but as she sat across from him, a quiet flicker of hope began to stir in her chest. It scared her, but it was there, a spark she thought had been extinguished long ago. The weeks that followed Maggie's fateful meeting with Daniel felt surreal, like stepping into a world she never believed existed. At first, she was wary. What did a man like Daniel Kingston, a successful businessman with wealth and charm, truly want from her? She had nothing to offer, nothing but her broken pieces. But Daniel never asked for anything. Instead, he offered her something far more valuable than money or pity: belief. It began with simple gestures. He introduced her to a quiet co-working space where Maggie could sit and think, undisturbed. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," he said as he dropped her off one morning, his smile reassuring. "Start with you. What do you want, Maggie?" What did she want? Maggie didn't have an answer. For years, she had been told what to want, who to be. First by her husband, then by his mother. Now, faced with the possibility of choosing for herself, she was paralyzed. "You have a fire in you," Daniel told her one day, as they sat on a bench overlooking a park. "You may not see it, but I do. Let's figure out how to light it." That was the beginning. Daniel encouraged Maggie to attend workshops and personal development events, places filled with people striving to improve themselves. At first, Maggie was intimidated. She stood at the edge of those rooms, surrounded by confident faces, feeling like an imposter. But Daniel was always there, nudging her forward. "I don't belong here," she whispered nervously at her first seminar, clinging to her seat. Daniel leaned toward her, his voice calm but firm. "Everyone starts somewhere, Maggie. Just listen today, that's enough." So she listened. She listened to speakers who talked about overcoming failures, building resilience, and finding strength within. Words like self-worth and purpose were foreign to her. But as she heard them again and again, something began to shift inside her. It didn't happen overnight. The change was gradual, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a long, dark storm. Maggie started to write in a notebook Daniel had given her, a small leather journal embossed with her name. She wrote down thoughts, dreams, and ideas that she had buried for years. It felt strange at first, like pulling weeds from hardened soil, but the more she wrote, the clearer her path became. One day, Daniel walked into the cafe where she now spent her mornings reading and scribbling ideas. "You've been busy," he said, glancing at the pages she had filled. "I've been thinking about starting something of my own," Maggie replied, surprising even herself. "A small business, maybe. Something that's mine." Daniel's eyes lit up. "That's what I like to hear. Tell me more." At first, her voice was hesitant, but the more she spoke, the stronger her words became. She wanted to start a small catering business, simple, homemade meals delivered to offices or homes. She had always loved cooking, even when it was thankless in her old life. This time, though, it would be different. This time, it would be for her. "Do you think I can do it?" Maggie asked, her voice trembling. "I know you can," Daniel replied without hesitation. "But the real question is, do you believe it?" Maggie didn't answer right away, but that night, as she sat at Lucy's kitchen table, she thought about his words. For so long, she had measured her worth by other people's standards. Now, for the first time, she was beginning to believe that she was capable of more. Over the next few weeks, Maggie threw herself into learning. She attended business workshops, met with mentors, and poured hours into researching her idea. Daniel guided her, offering advice but never taking over. "This is your dream, Maggie," he reminded her. "I'm just here to help you find the tools to build it." Maggie began to transform before everyone's eyes. Her posture straightened. Her voice grew stronger. She started to dress in a way that reflected her confidence, simple but elegant. Lucy, who had watched the change unfold, couldn't hide her smile one morning as she watched Maggie walk out the door with her notebook in hand. "You're glowing," Lucy said, grinning. Maggie paused, looking back. "I don't know what's happening to me, Lou, but for the first time in forever, I feel alive." Daniel noticed it too. One afternoon, after reviewing her business plan, he smiled at her and said, "I hope you realize just how far you've come." "I'm starting to," Maggie admitted. For years, she had been a woman who lived in shadows cast by her husband's indifference, her mother-in-law's cruelty, and her own fear. Now she was stepping into the light. She was learning to dream again, to believe in herself again. And as she stood before her first group of potential clients, presenting her vision for her catering business, Maggie felt something she hadn't felt in years: pride. Her hands no longer trembled, and her voice carried across the room with a quiet, steady strength. When she finished, Daniel met her at the door, his expression full of admiration. "That was incredible." Maggie smiled, a real, radiant smile. "I think I finally understand what you meant, Daniel. The fire, it's here, and I'm not letting it go." It was a warm spring afternoon when Maggie found herself at a local entrepreneurship fair, a vibrant event filled with laughter, chatter, and the hum of possibility. Maggie stood behind her small table, a simple but beautiful display of homemade dishes and freshly prepared samples, each labeled with care. Her catering business had just begun, but she was proud. This table, this work, it was hers. Her hands had built it, her determination had sustained it, and for once, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She was offering a plate of stuffed pastries to a young couple when a voice sliced through the hum of the crowd like a cold wind. "Maggie?" She froze. The plate in her hand wobbled as the voice settled deep into her chest, pulling her breath away. Slowly, she turned. Thomas stood there, his face familiar but softened, like a ghost that had been weathered by time. He looked different, thinner, warier, but his eyes still carried that same piercing gaze that once made her heart flutter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air around them seemed to tighten, and Maggie's pulse roared in her ears. "I can't believe it's you," Thomas said finally, his voice low, almost fragile. He stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over her. "You look different." "Different." Maggie swallowed hard, her spine straightening instinctively. "I am different." He nodded slowly, as though he knew. "I heard about everything, what you've been doing. You've come so far, Maggie." His voice carried something she hadn't heard in years. Admiration. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I was wrong, Maggie. About everything. I see that now." The words hung between them, heavy and uninvited. Maggie's throat tightened. For so long she had dreamt of this moment, of Thomas realizing his mistakes, coming back to her with apologies and regret. She thought it would bring her satisfaction, closure. But now, standing here, looking at him, she felt nothing. Thomas took a step forward, his voice growing softer. I want to make things right, Maggie. I want you to come home. Home. The word hit her like a slap. Home? She thought of the nights she had cried herself to sleep, of the rain that had soaked her as she stood on that doorstep with nowhere to go. She thought of his mother's scorn, of the way Thomas had thrown her away as if she were nothing. How could I go back to the prison I escaped from? The words formed in her mind before she could stop them. Her heart pounded, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Maggie? Thomas began again, his tone almost pleading now. I was blind. I let my mother get in the way. I didn't see how much you meant to me until you were gone. Maggie lifted her chin, her voice calm but unwavering. You didn't lose me, Thomas. You let me go. He flinched as though the words had struck him. Maggie, please. I don't belong in your world anymore. She gestured to the table beside her, the work of her hands. This is my world now, and I fought for it, alone. Thomas stared at her, his face a mix of pain and realization. For the first time, Maggie saw him as he was, not the man she once loved, but a symbol of the life she had survived. I'm sorry, he whispered, but Maggie only shook her head. Your apologies don't matter anymore. Her voice was steady, her heart free. I hope you find peace, Thomas, but I've already found mine. And with that, Maggie turned back to her table, her head held high as she greeted a new customer with a bright, confident smile. Behind her, Thomas stood frozen for a moment before fading into the crowd, his shadow disappearing among the sea of faces. Maggie didn't look back. She didn't need to. The past no longer had a hold on her. I am different, she reminded herself, a quiet smile forming on her lips, and for the first time in her life, she truly believed it. The evening sky had turned a soft shade of gold, the sun dipping below the horizon as Maggie stood on the rooftop of a tall building, overlooking the city that had become her home. The air was cool and clean, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic below. Daniel had invited her here, just the two of them, a quiet dinner under the stars. Maggie looked out at the skyline, the lights from buildings flickering like 1,000 tiny stars. Why here? She asked, turning to Daniel, who was arranging 2 glasses of wine on the small table he had set up earlier. Because, he replied, looking at her with a soft smile, I wanted you to see what's possible when you look beyond where you've been. Maggie tilted her head, her heart beating a little faster. Daniel had a way of saying things that made her pause and reflect, words that carried weight but never pressure. I'm not sure I follow. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a moment to admire her, his gaze lingering on her face as if he were memorizing every feature. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. Maggie, I've watched you transform over these months from the quiet, broken woman I first met into someone unstoppable, strong, independent, the woman you were always meant to be. Maggie opened her mouth to reply, but Daniel held up his hand, gently silencing her. Let me finish, okay? She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. I didn't know what to expect when I first met you that day in the cafe, he continued. All I knew was that I saw someone who had been through hell but still held on. And as I got to know you, I realized you weren't just surviving. You were becoming. He took a step closer, and Maggie felt her chest tighten. You don't need a man to define you, Maggie, Daniel said softly, his eyes locked onto hers. But I'd be honored to walk this journey with you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Maggie's heart stopped. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the rooftop quiet except for the sound of her own breath. Slowly, Daniel opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant diamond ring that caught the fading light, sparkling like the stars above them. Maggie, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, will you marry me? The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Maggie couldn't move. She felt 1,000 emotions rush through her at once, joy, disbelief, fear, and the echoes of her past. Her hands trembled as she looked at the man standing before her. Daniel wasn't Thomas. He wasn't a man who demanded, controlled, or belittled. He was patient, supportive, gentle. But Maggie wasn't the same woman she used to be. She had learned to fight for herself, to stand on her own 2 feet. And now, as she stared at the ring, she realized that Daniel was offering her a choice. Not salvation, not dependency, but partnership. Maggie started, her voice faltering. I don't know what to say. Daniel didn't flinch. He closed the box slowly, as if to assure her there was no pressure. "You don't have to decide tonight, Maggie. This isn't a race, and I'm not going anywhere." He smiled softly. "But I need you to know how I feel. You mean the world to me, not because I want to fix you, but because you make my life better, just by being in it." Maggie blinked back the tears that had begun to pool in her eyes. She turned away, looking out at the city, her mind swirling. Thomas's face flashed in her memory, the coldness, the dismissal, the emptiness she had felt as he threw her out. She thought of the life she had fought to rebuild, the confidence she had earned inch by inch. And now here was Daniel, offering her love, not as a crutch, but as an equal. How can I be sure? She thought. What if this ends the same way? What if I lose myself again? But then she heard Daniel's words echo in her heart. You don't need a man to define you. Maggie turned back to face him. Her voice was quiet but firm. I don't want to be saved, Daniel. I'm not broken anymore. Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I know. She stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. I never thought I'd meet someone like you, someone who sees me for who I am, not what I can give. But I need time. I need to be sure that this isn't me walking back into someone else's shadow. I'll wait, Daniel said simply, for as long as it takes. The sincerity in his voice broke through her fear like sunlight piercing through dark clouds. For the first time in a long time, Maggie felt the stirrings of hope that love could exist without ownership, without pain. I don't know what the future holds, Maggie said finally, her gaze meeting his. But I'll think about it, Daniel. I promise. That's all I ask, he said, placing the box gently back into his pocket. Take your time, Maggie. I'll be here. They stood in silence for a while, the city lights twinkling below as the night deepened. Maggie closed her eyes and breathed in the cool air, her heart steady. She had a choice now, one she could make on her terms, in her own time. For the first time, Maggie didn't feel trapped. She felt free. The morning sun streamed through the small window of Maggie's new apartment, warming her face as she sat at her modest kitchen table, staring down at her notebook. The pages were filled with business plans, ideas for recipes, and lists of suppliers she still needed to contact. Her catering business was growing, step by step, and then, though the journey was slow, every achievement felt like a victory. She thought back to the night on the rooftop when Daniel had proposed. His words had stayed with her like an echo in her mind. You don't need a man to define you. And for the first time in her life, Maggie truly understood what that meant. She looked at herself in the small mirror across the room. She saw a woman who had been tested, battered, and underestimated, but still stood tall. Her face was no longer a reflection of brokenness or loss. It was one of quiet strength and resilience. She had fought too hard to find herself again, and she wasn't about to let anything take that away. A knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Daniel stood there, holding a small box of pastries from her favorite bakery. Good morning, he said, smiling as if he could sense her thoughts. Morning, she replied, stepping aside to let him in. Daniel set the pastries on the table and glanced at the open notebook. You've been working hard. Maggie nodded, her hands resting on the pages. Every day, it feels like I'm building something real, something that's mine. She looked at him then, her voice steady but soft. Daniel, I've made a decision. His smile faltered for just a moment, as though bracing himself for a rejection he had already prepared for. Okay, I'm listening. Maggie took a deep breath, her words carefully chosen. I choose me, she said, her voice firm but calm. For the first time, I'm living for myself. I don't want to lose that. Daniel blinked, his expression unreadable for a moment before it softened into quiet understanding. You're choosing yourself, he repeated, as if letting the words settle into the space between them. Maggie nodded, her hands tightening slightly on the notebook. For so long, I let other people's expectations dictate who I was. First my husband, then his mother. I gave up parts of myself to fit into their mold. I can't do that again, not even for someone as kind and wonderful as you. Daniel looked at her with something Maggie couldn't quite name, pride, perhaps, or admiration. Maggie, he said softly, that's the bravest thing you've ever done. She met his gaze, searching for any hint of disappointment, but there was none. Instead, Daniel smiled, a smile so genuine it made her chest ache. I'm not going anywhere, he continued. If you want to focus on your business, on building this life you've fought so hard for, then I'll be here cheering you on. You don't need me, Maggie, but I'm honored to be part of your journey, however you want me to be. The relief that flooded Maggie was unexpected. She had been so afraid of losing him, of pushing away someone who believed in her. But Daniel's words reassured her that choosing herself didn't mean being alone. It meant being whole. Thank you, Maggie said softly, for understanding. Daniel shrugged lightly, a teasing glint in his eye. Well, you're pretty stubborn. I don't think I could stop you even if I wanted to. Maggie laughed, a sound that felt light and free. She turned back to her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. I have big plans, you know. I know, Daniel replied, leaning back in his chair, and I can't wait to see what you do. In that moment, Maggie realized that life didn't need to be defined by romantic love or dependence on anyone else. Her happiness, her success, and her identity were hers to create. Daniel's support was a gift, but it wasn't a crutch. She could stand on her own, and that was enough. As the day stretched on, Maggie worked with renewed energy. Daniel stayed quietly by her side, offering encouragement when she needed it, but always letting her take the lead. The business she was building, the life she was creating, these were her triumphs. I choose me, Maggie thought again, the words lighting a fire in her heart. And as she looked out the window at the bustling city below, she knew this was only the beginning. The soft morning light filtered through the large windows of Harvest Table, Maggie's new cafe and catering storefront. The scent of freshly baked bread and warm spices danced in the air, mingling with the quiet hum of chatter as customers came and went, filling the cozy space with life. Maggie stood behind the counter, arranging a display of golden croissants and handmade pastries. She wore a simple white apron, her hair pinned back neatly, but her face glowed with something more powerful than pride: freedom. It had taken years of hard work, sleepless nights, and relentless belief, but Maggie had built this. Her cafe wasn't just a business. It was a testament to the woman she had become, a woman who refused to let the world define her, a woman who had risen from ashes that once threatened to swallow her whole. "Morning, Maggie," a cheerful voice called. She looked up to see Mrs. Hawthorne, one of her regulars, beaming as she approached the counter. "I brought a friend today. You simply have to try Maggie's pastries," Mrs. Hawthorne said, turning to the woman beside her. The compliment sent warmth through Maggie's chest. "Good morning, Mrs. Hawthorne. What can I get for you today?" As Maggie prepared their order, she glanced around the cafe. Sunlight danced across the wooden tables, where young professionals typed on laptops, parents fed giggling toddlers bites of cinnamon rolls, and old friends reunited over steaming cups of coffee. This was her dream, alive and breathing. She had invested everything she had into this place: her time, her energy, her love. Daniel had been her cheerleader, offering advice when asked, but always stepping back to let her lead. Lucy, her ever-loyal friend, had rolled up her sleeves and joined her on weekends to paint walls and arrange furniture. Together, they had created this haven. But Maggie knew it was her vision, her blood and sweat, that had brought it to life. A bell chimed softly as a group of young women entered, laughing and taking photos of the cafe's rustic interior. Maggie smiled to herself as she overheard them. "This place is beautiful. And the owner? I heard her story. She's so inspiring." The words echoed in Maggie's mind. Inspiring. It still felt surreal to her that she could be seen as such a thing. A year ago, she had been standing in the rain, clutching her bags and broken heart. A lifetime ago, she had allowed people to define her worth. Now, as she handed Mrs. Hawthorne her order, Maggie felt something deep in her soul, something unshakable. "I've learned that no one has the power to break me unless I let them." The thought rang true, clearer than it ever had. She had been broken once, yes, but she had chosen to rise, and she had done so on her terms. Maggie stepped out from behind the counter as the morning rush slowed. She glanced at the corner table, where she kept a framed photo of her and Lucy during the cafe's opening day, grinning through exhaustion. Next to it was a small plaque Daniel had given her as a gift. "Strength is built when we decide to stand, no matter how many times we fall." A soft exhale escaped her lips as she looked at those words. She understood now that her worth didn't depend on her past or on anyone else's approval. Maggie had proven to herself and to the world that she was enough. strong, capable, and free. "Excuse me, are you the owner?" A young woman's voice broke through Maggie's thoughts. She turned to see a girl no older than 20, her expression shy but hopeful. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" I just wanted to say how much you inspire me," the girl said. "I read about your story online, how you started this place from nothing. It's incredible. I want to start my own business one day, too." Maggie's heart swelled. "Thank you," she said, offering the girl a kind smile. "You know, I started with no idea how I do this. The key is to believe you can and take it one step at a time." The girl nodded eagerly. "I will. Thank you so much." As the young woman left, Maggie stood still for a moment, absorbing the reality of it all. She had become someone others looked up to. Her struggle, her survival, it hadn't been in vain. The bell rang again, and Maggie snapped back to the present, ready to serve the next customer. As she moved back behind the counter, she whispered to herself, "I choose me, and that was the best decision I ever made." Her smile lingered as the cafe buzzed around her. For the first time, Maggie wasn't afraid of the future. She wasn't living for anyone else. She was living for herself, and that, she realized, was true freedom. Maggie stood outside her cafe as the day wound to a close, the golden sun casting long shadows across the street. She leaned against the doorframe, watching as the last few customers left, their laughter fading into the hum of the evening. The quiet felt comforting, a sign of a day well spent. She was about to lock up when she noticed a figure across the street. Her breath caught in her throat as Thomas stepped out of a sleek black car, his eyes fixed on her. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of years had settled into his bones. Maggie gripped her keys tightly, her pulse quickening. She thought she had prepared herself for this moment, for the possibility that one day he would come back, but nothing could quite erase the ghost of what they had been. Thomas approached slowly, his footsteps hesitant, and stopped a few feet away. "Maggie?" he said softly, his voice carrying the same familiar tone she had once fallen in love with. Maggie straightened, her expression calm but unreadable. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I heard about your cafe, about everything you've accomplished. I needed to see you." She crossed her arms, guarding herself. "Why?" Thomas's gaze fell for a moment before he met her eyes again. "To say I'm sorry," he admitted. "I was a fool, Maggie. I let my pride and my mother's influence destroy what we had. You didn't deserve the way I treated you." Maggie felt the sting of old wounds, but the pain was distant now, as though it belonged to someone else. She said nothing, letting him continue. "I see now what I lost," Thomas said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're incredible, Maggie. Strong, successful, the woman I should have stood beside, not pushed away." He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "I'm asking for a second chance. I want to fix this. I want you back." Maggie's heart remained steady. She looked at Thomas, the man who had once held so much power over her, and realized something profound. He no longer did. The Maggie he had known no longer existed. She shook her head gently. "Thomas, I'm not the woman you threw out of your house. I've changed." "Maggie." She raised her hand to stop him. "No, you don't get to rewrite the past. I spent so long believing I wasn't enough, that I needed you to define my worth. But I was wrong. I didn't need you then, and I don't need you now." Thomas's face fell, his hands dropping to his sides. "I never meant to break you," he whispered. Maggie's voice was soft but firm. "You didn't break me. You taught me how strong I could be. For that, I thank you." She took a deep breath, letting the last of her old hurt melt away. "Goodbye, Thomas." He stared at her for a moment, his eyes searching for something he couldn't find. And then, slowly, he nodded. "Goodbye, Maggie." As Thomas turned and walked away, Maggie felt no sadness, no regret, only a profound sense of peace. She watched him disappear into the distance, his figure swallowed by the fading light. Turning back toward her cafe, Maggie stepped inside and locked the door. For the first time, she was truly free. The sun bathed the park in golden light as Maggie walked along the gravel path, her steps light, her heart at ease. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, leaves catching sunlight like tiny stained glass windows. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the world around her hum softly in harmony with her thoughts. Beside her, Daniel walked quietly, his hands tucked into his pockets. There was no need for endless conversation. His presence was enough. Over time, their companionship had blossomed into something simple, something beautiful. A connection built on mutual respect, understanding, and the freedom to be themselves. Reaching a quiet bench overlooking a small pond, Daniel gestured for Maggie to sit. She smiled, sinking into the wood, her eyes reflecting the stillness of the water. Daniel sat beside her, silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "You know," he said softly, turning toward her, "I've watched you build a life out of the rubble others left behind. Not many people can do that, Maggie." She met his gaze, her heart calm. "I didn't do it alone." Daniel shook his head. "No, you did it because you're you, strong, capable, and relentless." He leaned back slightly, his voice steady but warm. "You're not defined by your past, Maggie. You're defined by the choices you make today." Maggie tilted her head, smiling faintly. "And what about you, Daniel? Why are you still here?" Daniel chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "Because I choose to be here. You don't need me, Maggie. That's what I love most about you." His words settled into the quiet between them, filling the spaces where doubt might once have lingered. Maggie knew he was right. She didn't need Daniel to complete her life. She was whole on her own. But having him beside her, it was a gift, one she was ready to accept. As the sunlight danced across the pond, Maggie reached out and took Daniel's hand. It wasn't an act of dependence, but of trust. "I'm ready," she said softly. Daniel smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "No rush, Maggie. We'll walk this road together, at your pace." And in that moment, Maggie knew this was love, not the kind that chained her to someone else's expectations, but the kind that set her free. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living the life she deserved. Maggie stood on the small stage, a spotlight casting a warm glow as she addressed the audience. The room was filled with women of all ages, their eyes fixed on her with rapt attention. Behind her, a banner read, "Empower Her, Stories of Resilience." Holding the microphone, Maggie took a deep breath. She wasn't nervous. This moment wasn't about her anymore. It was about them. "I used to believe that my worth was determined by how well I could fit into someone else's life," Maggie began, her voice steady and clear. "I thought love meant sacrifice, even if it meant sacrificing myself." The room was silent, each word hanging in the air. "But life has a way of teaching us lessons, even in the cruelest ways," she continued. "I was thrown out of a house I once called home. I stood under the rain with nothing but my dignity and a bag of clothes. That was the moment I thought I'd lost everything." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room, connecting with the faces in the crowd. "But I didn't lose myself, and that was the turning point." Maggie smiled faintly, the memories no longer stinging. "I rebuilt my life, brick by brick, learning that I didn't need anyone to define my value. My worth was mine to reclaim." Maggie looked out at the women, her voice firm with conviction. "To every woman here tonight, I want to tell you this. Don't ever lose yourself in marriage, in love, or in adversity. You are not someone's shadow. You are your own light." A murmur of agreement swept through the room, and Maggie pressed on. "Find your voice, your strength, and the life you deserve, because you do deserve it. You are stronger than you think. When life throws you out, find the courage to rewrite your story." As Maggie stepped back, the room erupted into applause, some women wiping tears, others smiling in hope. She walked off the stage, her heart full. Maggie had written her story, and it was beautiful. If this story touched your heart and you want more inspiring tales of hope, resilience, and the power of human connection, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that button and join us for more unforgettable journeys that will warm your soul and remind you of the beauty in life.